Welcome. We will get started in just a minute now. Thank you all for joining me on screen and to the attendees. My name is Beth Finch, and I want to offer a good evening. On behalf of the Colby College Museum of Art, it's a pleasure to welcome you, our speakers and attendees, to this Art and program dedicated to the topic of photographers' favorites, exploring the Tsiaras collection. Art and is an event series that brings together invited guests for conversations about exhibitions, collections, and projects at the Colby Museum and its Lunder Institute for American Art. This particular program accompanies the exhibition Active Sight, the Tsiaras Family Photography Collection, which is currently on view. Tonight's conversation is between the photographers Danny Dawson, Lola Flash, and Elizabeth Greenberg, and it will be led by another photographer, Séan Alonzo Harris. In order to maximize the time that our honored guests have in their speakers role this evening, bios for them will be dropped into the chat. And I will be leaving the screen soon, but before we get fully underway, I have some additional information to share with you. First is to point out the captions feature, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. It's the live transcript tab. In addition, this program is being recorded and will be available for with captioning in about a week on our website, should you want to revisit it or share it with others. I also want to offer an important acknowledgement related not to the virtual realm through which we gather this evening, but to place, and specifically Colby College, which is situated in the homelands of the Wabanaki people. We express our respect to the indigenous communities of these lands, past, present, and future. With this acknowledgement, we express our gratitude to be guests on this land and signal an ongoing commitment to building relationships with the Wabanaki. The value of cherishing relationships is particularly apt in the context of tonight's program. The inspiration for this art and conversation came from a chapter in the story of the Tsiaras collection. Specifically, the collection began with friendship. Bill Tsiaras had close friendships with Harry Callahan and Aaron Siskin, and I think we'll be seeing some works by them this evening as part of their conversation, of our conversation. And Bill collected Callahan and Siskin's photographs in depth. And he had conversations with these photographers, and those conversations led to other photographers in Providence and far beyond, Providence being where Dr. Tsiaras lives and works. Bill's network of friendships with artists and photographers and the values at play within these relationships, listening, learning from each other, and curiosity informed our conversation with Séan Alonzo Harris about this program. And Séan, a nationally recognized photographer who makes his home in Waterville, Maine, where Colby College is, Séan is the connector for tonight's event. We approached Séan with a proposal that he invite a group of photographers he admires to be in conversation with him about photographs in the Tsiaras collection that interest them as photographers and to learn about their photography as well. So that brings us back to where we began, the pleasure and honor of having Séan, Danny Dawson, Lola Flash, and Elizabeth Greenberg with us this evening. At the end of their conversation, or towards the end of our hour together, we will transition to a Q&A period, and I will come back on screen to help out with those questions that come in. So please, if you have a question, feel free. We encourage you to drop it into the Q&A feature also at the bottom of your screen. Thank you so much, and I turn it over to Séan.
Good evening, and thank you so much, Beth. That was awesome. Yes. So, anyways, the act of seeing. When Colby Museum came up and asked me about inviting friends to talk about work and this show, the act of seeing, I instantly thought of like Instagram, the act of seeing, how people scroll through the images and they don't have the they're not really taking that time, like they're not like engaging with the act of seeing. And so we proposed to the three, Elizabeth Greenberg, Lola Flash, and Danny Dawson, look at this body of work and your body of work and see what comes about. And yes, so with that, we all came up with a body of work or works from the show. And yeah, so without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Elizabeth so she can talk about the work and what her picks are. And we'll come back at the end and we'll discuss some works that I picked out from the show. And yeah, and then questions. And hopefully we have answers. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Sean. And, you know, I always think, having known you for so many years, that, you know, it can be trouble when we start talking about pictures. That can be an endless conversation and so rewarding. So I want to thank you, Sean, for the invitation to be in this conversation tonight. I want to thank Beth Finch and Kristen Berquist and the Colby Museum of Art to participate. And I could not be more grateful or honored to be in this conversation with Lola Flash and Danny Dawson. It's wonderful to be included here and talk about this beautiful collection from the Tsiaras family. I had the privilege to go see the show in person a few weeks ago, and it is not only an extraordinary collection, but an exquisite installation of it. And as I looked through the book and also through the exhibit, I feel like every image reminded me of why I fell in love with photography. I think I'm supposed to do something here with the screen and move a picture. Yes, indeed. There you go. So these images, they felt like reconnecting with old friends. They felt close and familiar. And I love that that was such a part of how the collection was built. I fell in love with photography in high school and would spend endless hours in the library, the Scottsdale Public Library out in Arizona, going through every single of the very few photography books that they had. Among those were Arnold Newman and Richard Avedon, Mary Ellen Mark, Irving Penn, Eugene Richards. And in looking through those same books over and over, I was just captivated by what photography could do. The way that it can record, preserve, transform, and the way that it represents history. And in one way, an act of seeing that introduced me to what I had never seen or would never be able to see, but also the way that it would inspire my imagination, which has always been fairly vivid and active. And, you know, as I thought about, no matter how documentary the stance of a photographer, the images, especially in black and white, seem to be transformed. And, you know, this beautiful image, Harry Callahan's image of windows in Chicago, 1948, these were the images that inspired me to consider photography as a language, as a way to express personal experience. And for me, in ways that words often failed, or that I could never find. So thankfully, my love and passion for photography and truly a dedication to the medium has provided me an opportunity to live a life in pursuing a career as an artist, looking at making pictures, teaching, and being a mentor, and not to mention opportunities for great conversations with so many interesting artists. My undergraduate work was at Rhode Island School of Design, and after Harry Callahan was there, though his visions and his teachings were still very prominent and a huge part in influence in my formative years as a photographer. After college, I began what has now become a 30+ year relationship with Maine Media. And it's where I was introduced to so many of my photography heroes, including Arnold Newman, and had the opportunity to move to New York and work with him for what ended up being close to a decade. And it's very safe to say that his art, learning history from him, learning history from his images, and his tenacity as an artist, they affected me. They taught me how to live and work as an artist. They taught me about honesty in images. And to this day, you know, Arnold passed in 2006, but I'm so pleased to work with the Arnold and Augusta Newman Foundation and award the annual Arnold Newman Prize for New Directions in Photographic Portraiture. So interestingly, though, people think, oh, you worked for Arnold Newman, and I never take pictures of people. In fact, my work, ever since my very first rolls of Tri-X, I have always explored places, and I think of myself really as an archaeologist, a visual archaeologist, and I'm looking for evidence of what has been before me, what might be there, what might be the future, what might be signs and symbols and little artifacts. And I look for these fragments that might echo my own past. And I look for them in the landscape. I look for them everywhere I go. I photograph daily. It's a way for me of truly practicing an art of seeing. I try to forget what I know and rely on what I can see to find and discover stories in the landscape, thinking about magic that exists, magic beyond what we can see, and only what we can feel, what we can experience, as Arnold would say, with our hearts and with our minds. I seek to photograph what is no longer there. And I often say that my photographs are of what is not there, but for me. Light is nearly always my muse, light in atmospheric conditions. I'm interested in photographing what's no longer there and thinking of light as the presence of an absence. I also love the way that it can transform and show us a different way, show us a different experience beyond the real, what's transformed, and see what is in my own imagination or my own intuition in experiencing a place. When I was going through the exhibition, I came across this image of Barbara Norfleet's, and I was immediately moved by the spectacular light, the way that portions of the corrugated metal reveal windows into a world outside. So we have an interior world with this fractured, fragmented, exploding light, and then looking out at the trees, the leafless trees mostly out, that appear to be in a wild, abandoned, neglected place. And it brought to my mind an image that I made quite some time ago. And this was in an abandoned cement factory, where the reality of the place was very grim. There were horrific things graffitied on the walls, terrible words, terrible symbols. And in fact, the light dances through bullet holes that are in the roof of the building. And yet through light, it was transformed to me into a palace of light, perhaps suggesting another presence and other ways of being and experiencing that place. So for me, that's the beauty of photography. And I was just so incredibly moved by the collection and the beautiful way of considering the different periods of history that are represented in the works. And I think the power of the image to move time, to record, and for us to see. There are probably 100 other images that influenced and deeply moved me from there. But that was just my insight, some images that impacted and meant a lot to me in seeing it. And so now I am going to introduce and pass this over to a good friend, a scholar, an extraordinary photographer, Charles Daniel Dawson.
Thank you, Elizabeth. In fact, thank you for showing that incredible work, which I had not seen. I'm really happy to see your own work. You know, it is really beautiful. But I also want to thank, as you did, Beth, Chris, and Andrew for the invitation from the Colby Museum to participate in the Tsiaras collection. Again, I'm honored to be working with Séan, who invited me. Séan, thank you for the invitation, and to Elizabeth and to Lola to look at their work too. This is some of my later work in Brazil. It's from a festival called Bumba Meu Boy, and a lot of the work that I've done has been based on looking at and documenting African culture in the Americas too, but with my own particular take on it. And Bumba Meu Boy is one of the earliest festivals in Brazil. It's actually pre-carnival, but it started in the 1700s, and it's really it was a ceremony that was making fun of the master in terms of the slaveocracy of Brazil. So there's a whole story of a bull being born, the Bumba, but the boy is the bull, and the being born and being sacrificed and then being resurrected by an Indian holy man. Again, these are some of the figures from that too. Andrew, could I go to the next photographs too? Again, this is a caboclo de pena. That's the caboclo, or the mixed blood of the feather and the mixed blood of the ribbon. You can see on the left the mixed blood of the ribbon. In the center is the headdress of the mixed blood of the feather. But it's really funny because the people who are dancing this are basically farmers, and that costume after a night of dancing is a 50-pound costume of wet feathers. So, but it's an incredible festival. Nobody, even in Brazil, they don't know about it too. But it initially started with the oldest form was called Zabumba, and it's a very African form with African drumming in it too. Next slide, please. These are two figures from that too. The donor, the fazenda, that's the owner of the farm. He's the person who owns the bull. And on the right is the caboclo. It's a woman who is the female figure of a young woman who's a caboclo. Again, I'd like to use a lot of motion in some of the work too. Next slide, please. And then this is just one photograph of the popcorn vendor, and you see the stage in the back where the Bumba Meu Boy festival is going on, but then the popcorn machine. And every time I see this photograph, I think I can still smell that popcorn, cooking in the streets. Could I look at some of the black and white work too? Oh, so this is again a Bumba Meu Boy. This is the Zabumba, the bateria, the drumming section of the Zabumba. And this is some of my oldest work. This is John Houston. It's actually the oldest brother of Whitney Houston. And it reminds me of the early Andrew Cortez picture, a photograph of a woman on a couch where you're playing with the arms and legs being vectors, being graphic forces, the graphic shapes that have energy to them. Next slide, please. Two early photographs, two from the 60s. A drum and Dawn Finley, a little girl dancing in her living room. Next slide. This is one of my early pieces from called Backscape, and I want to juxtapose this with the Harry Callahan piece called, I think it's Harry Callahan or Aaron Siskin piece called Martha's Vineyard. It's one of the same photographs that Lola uses too. Is it possible to pull up the Harry Callahan? In this, I was trying to take a human shape and make it a landscape, but also to make it an abstract. So it's a landscape, but it's also, for me, it's an abstraction, which is very much what I think Harry Callahan is playing with, or Aaron Siskin is playing with his Martha's Vineyard. Andrew, is it possible to find the Harry Callahan? I mean, the Aaron Siskin, Martha's Vineyard? Oops, well, that's my grandma Thomas. And this,
We'll pull that up for you.
Okay.
Dan, just a moment.
We go back a little bit. This is my grandmother in her yard in Bedford Hills, New York. Next, please. Judith Jameson and Michelle Murray of the Albanelli Company. And I wanted to juxtapose this with the James Vandersea photograph of the women dancing, the young ladies dancing too. But this was a rehearsal in 1970 for Albanelli at one of his dance studios. Next, please. And a photograph, a portrait of Mary Baraka, who was actually one of my muses, one of my supporters early on when I started photography. I did a series of photographs that he did an exhibit with too. Next slide. This is Ola Ife and Egypt. It's an early piece of my goddaughter and statues from ancient Egypt with a juxtaposition too. I was taught by Ralph Hattersley, one of my teachers, who also taught Jerry Ullsman. I don't think this is Ullsman-esque, but it also uses that kind of overlaying of images too. But I was fortunate in terms of learning photography because I learned from my father, but I also learned from Ralph Hattersley. And I also studied with Lisette Modell. And then I also studied photo history with Peter Bunnell and John Sarkowski from the Museum of Modern Art. Next slide. Oops. This is the James Vanderzee that I mentioned to the tap dance class rehearsal. I want to juxtapose this with my photograph of Judith and Michelle Mary dancing too. But the Vanderzee was actually interesting because for me, because I was the James Vanderzee curator of photography, film, and video at the Studio Museum in Harlem. And it was a title I created because of his collection. They had 59,000 pieces of Vanderzee's work. But what Vanderzee really did was he would capture the spirit of the people of Harlem in the teens and in the 20s and 30s. And this is an example of that too. These are young women dancing in a dance rehearsal. Harlem used to be full of dance studios and dance halls with people loving dance. And dance was one of the major factors in terms of African-American cultural life. A lot of the women that you see dancing came out of the chorus lines. The chorus lines are an important part of Harlem cultural life. But Vanderzee did a kind of formal portrait of the tap dance rehearsal. And Vanderzee, in one sense, didn't consider this as fine art. He considered this work he did to make a living. His fine art was violin playing and music too. But because of the spirit of the people and because of his ability to capture it, he changed. Actually, there was a revelation in the way he worked with the people of Harlem, and he also gave the identity to the age through through photographs. Next slide. I'm still trying to find the Siskin. That's the Siskin that I wanted to juxtapose with that image. In my case, I'm trying to take a human being, turning it into a landscape, but also turning it into an abstract. In Siskin's case, in Hurricane, in Siskin's case, what he's doing is turning a landscape into an abstraction. So which is I love the kind of flipping of images and flipping of the ideas in terms of how you use a graphic idea to transform something from being something very specific to being something very symbolic. So he's taking a landscape, but making it almost like an abstract painting in terms of the graphics that he uses. Next slide. Let's see if we had one more. I was thinking. No, we can go back then because it's now Lola. Again, this is kind of disjointed discussion in terms of myself, but I'm just happy to be here and to be able to even talk about these ideas about photography and how transformative photography is too. Because it is certainly not simple. It certainly can be symbolic and can have all kinds of different references that are not just graphic, but also historical and symbolic. In the case of the Siskin piece, I think this is symbolic. And in the case of mine, I think it's symbolic also. And not to even equate my work with the quality of Aaron Siskin's work too. But Siskin was one of my influences when I started photography too, as was Harry Callahan too. So again, I would now like to turn this over to Lola Flash, who is also an incredible photographer, but who's also a member of this group that I'm in, also Kamonge. When you look at the background I have for my, when I'm talking, that's the background of a group called Kamonge, a group of African-American photographers who got together in 1963 and we still meet. And Lola is right now the secretary for that group, and she's one of the honorable members of Kamonge. Thank you, Lola.
Thank you, Brother Danny. Thank you for this wonderful book and for the chance to be a part of this conversation. I really sort of, let's see, should I move it? I really got carried away with research. I've got like about 7 pages here. I'll do my best to freestyle, but let me get started. Thanks for coming, everyone. Happy Tuesday. So my first slide shows a pairing of one of my photographs to William Christenberry's country store with gasoline pumps. Last week I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I happened to take this photograph to the left on Route 66. And I've always had a fascination for these old kind of pumps. But while I was in Tulsa, of course, you can imagine, I did a really deep dive into the Tulsa Massacre. And I just started thinking about, kind of I guess, the horizontal kind of timeline. So, I went to a center that I learned a lot about these Tulsa Massacre. And I'm not, if you don't know what that is, it's really quickly, it was at one point there was something called Black Wall Street that was full of Black businesses, people who owned lands, and that's a whole nother story. And some of them actually benefited from this, what is it called, this derrick. It's a 194-foot tall oil derrick, and it was the first oil strike that they had in 1901. And so the reason why I started thinking about this, I don't know, I guess the pain. So, there were the kids that were that night of the Tulsa Massacre, the high school kids were getting ready to go to their prom party at the Booker T. Washington High School. And of course it was canceled. I also looked at this area where there was there's nothing but grass, and there's some stone steps that lead up to nothingness. So it's called the Stairways to No Return, because there used to be homes. Because it's their stone, they didn't burn down in the massacre. But getting back to Krista Berry's photograph, I actually didn't know him. I have to admit, I wasn't aware of his photography. But in my research, I realized that he was friends with Walker Evans and William Eggleston, who I know. So thinking about what Beth was talking about, this idea of friendship, it sort of just carries on. He was kind of considered one of the pioneers of color photography. And that's another reason why I like this photograph. I love the symmetry. It's always very prominent in my photographs, the textures and the colors. Also, he used a brownie for this photograph. Some of his photographs were an 8x10, but this one is actually a brownie. And he grew up in this area, and he used to come back. He ended up moving to Washington to teach, and he would come back to photograph. And I think this particular time, actually I read that he was here with Walker Evans. So his story about this picture is like, he says he wants to get feelings. To me, I feel like it's very nostalgic. And when I see Alabama, I get it triggers me. Okay, I think about, the place where the state where Martin Luther King was killed, right? I think about the church that the four young girls were killed in, the 16th Street Baptist Church where the 4 young girls were killed in. This is 1974, and these events that I'm talking about happened in the 60s, but this store looks like this, pumps look like they were there in the 60s. So my thought is, like, were some of the people who were part of all of this hatred, did they fill up here? It's sort of, I just get a different feeling about this picture than I think it's supposed to be meant. And I believe that that's what photography does, just like writing. Depending upon where you come from, you have all kinds of other ideas and triggers that happen. I'll show you another picture and talk about another artist, but just really quickly, I wanted to talk about my series, which is called Syzygy the Vision, and it's basically based on Afrofuturism. So just briefly, I'm thinking about the past, the present, and the future, right? And so you can see me here. I'm not sure if you can see really well, but I've got my space helmet on, speaking to the future. I've got a prison uniform on and handcuffs, right? Speaking about, one, the ridiculous incarceration system that we have here in America, the worst in the whole world. And also thinking about freedom. As Black people, as queer people, are we really free? And I'll leave that for you to answer. I threw this one in because I always loved Lucas Samaris's work. He's one of the people similar to what Elizabeth was saying, like, that I learned about, and sort of like they feel like they're your friends. And I used to always love Lucas's work because, one, I loved playing around with Polaroids and doing similar things to what he did. Was like, once it's developing, you kind of scratch at the surface. And so I kind of, since I would say the 80s, since last century, I was working so basically from the 80s to the beginning of the century, I was working in what I call cross color. I've always been, at that point I had always been manipulating color. So I saw a sort of parallel between our work. No triggering there. And then the next series, okay. In February, this is another recent photograph that I took, which is, as you can see, part of the Syzygy series. It's taken in Joshua Tree. And, this idea of like a new explorer, also putting like a Black body, a queer body into these landscapes where we don't always see ourselves, right? I mean, we're often seen in more city, urban kind of environments than, beautiful landscapes. So I love that about working in this kind of a landscape. And sometimes it just feels like I just kind of dropped down from some other planet, right? And it makes me think about the moon and thinking about areas that haven't been colonized. It's this place where I can kind of start off from just being okay and not being a person that has come from years and years, hundreds of years of enslavement. And so, as Danny was saying, we paired our pictures, we talked about this similar pictures. Oops, oh no, don't close your eyes. I don't know why I skipped there. So for me, this photograph, and again, we're different people. So what I see in this picture is I think about, seeing the title that was taken in Martha's Vineyard, it brings me joy. I really think about this idea of joy. Martha's Vineyard, my aunt took me there like over 50 years ago. I remember riding the iconic carousel and being too young to even know what the difference between silver and gold was, because you could grab like this sort of ring. And I believe if you got a gold ring, you could go around again. Of course, it talks, we've heard recently that the Obamas are there. My buddy Skip Gates has a place there, right? So a lot of notable people, I think Oprah as well. It's a safe place where we can go as we are not questioned. That's what Maya Angelou said. And it was actually, Massachusetts was actually one of the first states to abolish slavery. Yet, the first Blacks that came to Martha's Vineyard was actually indentured servants, whalers, and domestic workers. So we've come a long way from there, but it always brings me this sense of joy. And I just really want to quickly quote Siskin, because he said that he began to feel the importance of how these rocks hovered over each other, touched each other, pushed against each other. He likened this contiguity, sorry about that, to family relationships, especially that between the mother and child. He believed that the pair of rocks pictured in the photograph would consciously or not evoke emotions in the viewer, and that these emotions would both be deep-seated and universal. So he thinks of it as like this human drama of a landscape, which I think is really beautiful, and we don't always know what us photographers are thinking, right? But again, here I am feeling the need to put myself into this space. And I just saw a real similarity between his work and my work. There were plenty more as well. I had to really stop myself because we have a limited amount of time. But it was really, I don't think I've ever looked at a collection in this way, comparing my work to others' works. And it's kind of a cool thing to kind of see work that was done 100 years ago or 50 years ago that mimics some of the things that you're thinking about, maybe visually, but not mentally, right? So I think that's the thing about us humans, is right? Like there are all kinds of triggers and all kinds of things, notions that make us either freak out or feel like happy and in love, and at the end of the day, feel joy. And so for me, with my series, Syzygy the Vision, the end narrative is that we're going to be jumping from planet to planet in pure ecstasy, pure joy. It's going to have a happy ending. And that's my ending. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you so much. That was awesome. I completely enjoyed everyone's presentation and their take on how these images play back and forth from their own work to the works in this collection. And it's so awesome to see. Let's start here. Now I thought when everyone was talking, I thought it would be a kind of cool idea to kind of all of us kind of add in and dissect this image. Like, first of all, like I think this is pleasure and fear, pleasure and terror. And for me, this image of just like being suspended in air and like this weightness, this like weightness. The song that comes to mind is by oh geez, so sorry. The song that comes to mind is by Nina Simone, and she talks about and she sings through, and one of the lyrics is like to be free and to, you know, if I could fly, you know, I feel that with this image, and how just like how the light just captures certain parts of the body, how some parts go into complete shadow, and you just grab some of the just some of the essence of the body, that it almost feels like he's like he could be like almost in a cloud, and this and just the motion and the stillness of it really talked to me. How let me ask, add in here, guys, just to see what you guys are thinking or feeling when this image comes up.
Sean, you know, outside of the kind of psychological terror that this kind of image brings to mind, you know,
Right.
Is he going to land on his back, or is he going to flip over like a cat, you know, that kind of thing? But that's one of the things I learned from Ralph Hattersley, that photography has that kind of potential. That we can just look at the photograph, but it means a lot more on a psychological level too. But also in terms of historical level, this also reminds me of the incredible range of Siskin's images. You know, just the whole, his subject matters were so varied and so different. But he also always tended towards some kind of abstraction, even though he might be shooting nature, it still ends up being an abstract painting.
Right. It also, I mean, but to me, like, I understand, like you see this person suspended in air, but like, just because of like Siskin's style of photography, it also makes it almost feel like he's like on cotton or in a cloud, like he feels it, like the way that it's suspended, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but you know, as human beings, we also know that something like that falls. You know, so you know, we have human experiences, so we know that there's gravity. So there's always that's why he's talking about terror of levitation, you know.
Exactly.
Because part of the terror of levitation is the terror of falling, you know, so.
Excuse me, I mean, I would say that similarly, thinking about the range of Siskin's work, and that, you know, in his abstractions, he seems to always be talking about something much bigger than the subject itself. So, you know, we can look at this on an aesthetic level and think about the beautiful form, this silhouette of the body in motion falling, the black on white, it's graphic, you know, aesthetically, it's beautiful. And yet I feel like this can sit right next to one of his, you know, images of peeling paint and detritus. And equally, they talk about the fragility of our experience, of what human experience is, and both the pleasures and terrors of post-war era, of, you know, what was happening politically in the 50s, and just there's so much more than the subject, you know, and the way that he was using these images and creating them as symbols.
Yeah, Elizabeth, that's, you know, really interesting for me, because I remember curating a show with Roy DeCarava, and Roy talked about it. He was like pole vaulting, when you vault and you reach a point where you're actually, there's stasis before you go up or go down, you're just floating. And it reminds me of that, but it also reminds me of the fact that with Siskin's work in particular, that even though we're at that point, we realize there's a history of before and after. So that's why that's where this terror comes. He's
Yeah.
trapped in that moment, but Siskin always shows you that this came from somewhere and it's going somewhere. You know,
Exactly. Exactly. But
there's a weight to the image because of that.
right. I think about like the idea that the person that the subject decided to be in that position. Like, you know what I mean? Like he had to have made that decision to jump and then float, you know, and Siskin caught him, you know, like that whole motion.
Yeah, but you know, Sean, that part of the power of that is you don't know if he's making a statement or asking a question.
Right.
Exactly.
You know,
Right.
Exactly.
so you're still trying to figure out what's happening. What is really, did he catch him as he's diving, as he's somersaulting? Did he have a fast shutter speed? What happened, you know?
Exactly.
So, but it works as a kind of provocative image incredibly. You know, the way Elizabeth talked about, it's an abstraction, but it's also a beautiful human form, you know, against a white backdrop floating in space.
Right.
I do remember the first time I saw this picture thinking to myself, wow, you can do that with photography, you know, because it wasn't just taking a picture of something, right?
Right. Also, the question to Elizabeth for me is there a surf beneath him? Are there rocks beneath him? Well, you know,
exactly.
he has to come down.
Water.
He's coming down. So what's going to happen when he comes down? You know, so.
Right. Hopefully there's a trampoline or water or something.
Right.
There's but yeah, exactly. But that's exactly the same thing, because I was introduced to Siskin not through these people, but just like his paint chips and like all of his abstract through shooting through things and stuff like that. And I was just like, wow, this is amazing work. You know what I mean? It was the first time that I fell in love with a photographer who didn't shoot people, you know.
Didn't he also do a series on the railroad tracks out in the West? Of kind of roadkill. I think that was Siskin. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. Yeah, but if you come to the show, there is a lot of Siskin in this show, and and it just reinforced, and I recognized how much I love his work, and it was like the most amazing thing to see real prints, which was like just absolutely amazing and gorgeous. Yeah,
I think that's really funny. That's one of the funny things about the Tsiaras collection is, again, the range in the collection too, but the kind of quality of the selection. So, you know, you keep remembering why you became a photographer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And each one, and I just thought about each one of us have started photography before, before high school, and you know what I mean, or at a high school age. So this is one of our oldest loves beyond our parents, you know what I mean, and our family and our friends. I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know. Yeah, well, let's go to the next. Let's go to the next image. Oh, and this is an absolutely gorgeous image. It's the same thing. It's kind of like the, with the Eugene Smith in this moment of like uncertainty, like you like when you look at this image, and this is the power of photography as well. You're not sure if this is a pleasing moment or like they're walking through and they might be a little cold, or it's this like dreadful moment where they're like being evacuated. And the questions are you don't know because of just the expressions on the face. You know, and that's the power of photography. It can make you think one thing, but it's another.
Yeah, it's funny because knowing Eugene Smith's work and thinking of him as a photojournalist and kind of straight photographer, then you realize how much he manipulated every image he made. You know, so he was a master of the manipulation, but it was so subtle that you didn't realize the image might be patched together. You know, so But look at the play of the foreground and the background. The background is almost an abstraction. It's really, almost mythic kind of landscape of some, and then in the beginning is that question: Are they leaving? Are they happy? Are they being exiled? Or what's going on? You know, so. Exactly.
And the choice of focus is key here. You know what I mean? It's like this super soft focus. It's like this, it gives it this feeling of like, feeling of like this delicate moment, you know?
Yeah. Sean, you know that Lou Draper, one of the founders of Kamonge, used to be Eugene Smith's assistant. He used to print these photographs.
Ah,
So,
I know that.
another one of my heroes.
uh,
Yep. Yeah.
I like it because because it goes against the sort of mother and child,
Right.
that's the norm. So that's one of the things I like about it. And definitely the short depth of field really just kind of focuses on the two subjects. Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. And that was shot with probably a Leica that it was like, that he could have made that image tack sharp, but it could have been because of the situation and just moving. And also the amount of light that was available too.
what year did he do Miyamoto? Do you know? I wonder if this was around the same time.
I'm not sure.
He did a whole series on the pollution of the town by a paper mill.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure of the time, but yeah, this is
a beautiful selection, boy.
Yeah, it's a wonderful image.
Again, yeah. Elizabeth, as you were saying, this just reminds me of, is it a statement or is it a question?
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. And I have another image. I have actually two more, but I think we can get to this last one, which is really cool. I think in some ways I tried to pick out images that that everyone could relate. That I picked out this image because thinking of Danny and having conversations with Danny, because Danny used to have a stand-up bass and he had to give it away because someone had lost it and he felt bad.
Gave it away to somebody who could really play it.
Who could use it.
Right.
But I love this image because of the way that it plays with lines and shape and
look, I have a good friend, Jay Potter, who's a photographer in New York, and Jay's also an actor, but he's a great photographer. And he has a picture from Cuba of someone carrying a bass in the street. So I guess in Cuba, it's kind of common to carry basses in the street,
Right, because they're not light instruments,
Oh, they're light. But in New York, they put wheels on them and they roll them in the street.
Right, exactly. But this image I just love the play with shape and figure and like the pyramid in the background.
That kind of multiple layers, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and I love this about photography. It's funny. I think that I joke that I probably haven't made a picture in focus in 30 years. But if I could, I'd want to do street photography. And I love the way the camera frame can put together relationships that only exist for that fraction of a second.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Like the relationship between the man carrying the base and the pyramid, the way the neck of the base fits right into the edges of that mural. And then you've got two other worlds on the other side. And this relationship only happened for that fraction of a second, and the way that in the power of, thinking about other street photographers, Winogrand, that, so often, I mean, this for me is about this idea of transformation, because it only existed for that fraction of a second and it had to be seen. Mm-hmm. It can't be known, right? It's about like living life with your eyes open and, looking at it that way and creating these transformed moments. Like I absolutely love the relationships in this picture.
What I find funny though, Elizabeth, right where that side of the pyramid meets the curve in the base.
I know.
That throws me off. That's just like, that's almost like a different painting or a different photograph. There's some interest right at that spot where I'm locked in there.
Yeah, it's a bit like a collage or something, huh?
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it actually reminds me of some of Arnold Newman's early work when he was so heavily influenced by the Cubists and modernist painters, and thinking about those juxtapositions, that it's sort of that same sensibility, but here found on the street.
Right. Elizabeth, when you showed that Arnold Newman portrait, you know, it really reminded me of the whole series of portraits by Cartier-Bresson too, which I never made that
Oh.
association before too. You know?
Yeah, they're gorgeous.
Yes, they're just amazing.
Bresson portraits are beautiful.
Right. They're just amazing. Yeah, this is like one of those images that I would call you fell into the photograph, you know what I mean, as a photographer, because you have to read the rhythm of the street. You're not going to show up and get the shot. You almost feel it happening, and then you fall into it, you know.
Well, actually, he probably timed them walking down the street, boy.
Yep.
Saw him coming with the bass and said, "Uh-oh."
But even at that,
yeah,
but even at that, there's no way that you would possibly, like, you know what I mean? Like, you can time it, but these cameras, well, I guess in 95, but you know, it's not, I mean, that like there is a little bit of like anticipation and luck to I mean, because that where the base, the curvature of the base and the way that lines up is just brilliant, you know. It's like amazing. All right, well, let's go see the last slide, because we might as well see it. Yeah. Oh, okay, this one right here. Oh, right here. Harry Carter-Bresson. This is Gandhi's funeral, you know, and you know, and these are I know these are orange flowers, because that's what they, in India, that's what they give out. They give out those braids of flowers at funerals. And I just love the play and just how like this capture of emotion and this sorrow time, because he was such a beloved figure. You know, we know what it is, but at the same time, you can see everyone reaching, and you know, yeah.
Sean, do you know how the Tsiaras collected this photograph?
No, I don't know how all these photographs were acquired. I know we know about Siskin and Callahan, you know, because he worked on their eyes, but I think he built relationships between those two, and I think his world of photography just grew and grew. That's my assumption, but I can't be sure, you know, and he might have seeked out some images as well, you know, on his own.
Sean, I'm jumping on since we're heading towards the hour, and we can go over a little bit, but I would also add, I don't also know how this particular photograph was acquired, but I think you know, after Bill Tsiaras began collecting photographs from friends, he also got interested in the history of American photography, and also there's also, you know, a lot of depth in documentary photography. So key figures like Cartier-Bresson, you know, I think he focused on and wanted to make sure he had as part of the collection. One thing I will mention is that I know we have a lot of photo experts as visitors to the panel, because someone helpfully provided us with a link to that W. Eugene Smith photograph. So I'm dropping that in here. And another attendee noted that Aaron Siskin also photographed as part of the Photo League in his Harlem document before he turned to abstraction. But the first question we received relates to how photographs are used today by non-photographers and by photographers alike. So an attendee asks, how does the snapshots of today, from the Brownie camera to the Polaroid to the Instagrams of today, relate to this wonderful collection and your own work in, you know, your own relationship to, in a sense, vernacular photography, I think is the attendee's question.
I'll jump in first.
Okay.
Well, you know, for me, to be honest with you, it really makes me want to continue working with my 4x5 camera. the latest series that I showed you, Syzygy the Vision, is actually with a digital camera, and because a lot of times I'm getting people to photograph me, so it's kind of easier for other people to use a digital camera than a 4x5. But my true love is taking portraits with the 4x5 camera. If I could afford it, I think I'm on my way, you all. That I want to start doing some 8x10 work, because the reason is because one considers the image so much longer, and you're moving the camera around, getting it exactly right, and you kind of, it's almost like this spiritual feeling, like you can feel when you got the right shot, you know what I mean, even though you can't see it. And now, because we don't have Polaroid cameras for the large format cameras, I use a digital camera just to check my lighting and everything, but I still have to wait till to go to the process, to the lab to go and get it. So I just love that kind of thing. And usually if you go to my lab on 35th Street or wherever it is, you might see me like going, yes, because it's like, you don't know, even though, I'm an expert, I just never really know. You don't know if you didn't put the film in right. And so I'm just old school, and I just love that kind of anticipation. And I like just having like 6 or 7 pictures. Sometimes I only take 6 frames. And I think also for me as a portrait photographer, this is my last little bit, is that when one photographs with a 4x5 camera, people aren't like that, right? They're like, they kind of like give you, they kind of, they posture, right? Because it's not just like a selfie, right? You actually have this big camera in your face. And so, a lot of my work is about, uplifting my communities. It's about beauty. So I think that for me, I feel people just really kind of like, I don't know, I think it's a better connection. I feel better connected to my models at the end of the day, using my big camera than just snapping like 100 pictures. Like what I shoot with my digital camera, I still try to work not to take that many photographs, but it's like the editing is just kind of like crazy. You're like, well, I like this one, but this is a little, it's just too much. So I particularly like, I like my 4x5, but I will say I do love the fact that everyone has a camera now, right? Everyone has a phone. I love the fact that people are more visual. And I think that a lot of people out there realize that it's not easy being a great photographer. It takes skills, not just, snapping. So it's kind of a long-winded answer, but 4x5 forever.
Yes.
Lola, I don't have any.
Come up to Maine, I will let you use my 8x10.
Okay, I'm coming.
Come on.
Lola, I have no fond remembrance of that terror of the weight. I'm really happy digital came about, I think there's a kind of democratization of the imagery too. But also I think one of the initial questions about the different range of formats that you can use, and I think it's all image making. That's why you have a rebirth of lomography. That's why they bring out the equivalent to Brownie cameras over and over again, because it's just about how do you use whatever instrument you have to tell a story. So 8x10 and waiting for that is too daunting for me. Lola, I just gave away a 4x5. A 4x5 I had about 10 years and never used.
Oh, right. Cool.
I had enough.
This conversation has been so inspiring, and I have loved listening to Elizabeth speak about being a visual archaeologist, and Danny's discussion of using motion in the work, and the way that all the senses are evoked through your work, not just the visual, but the weight of the objects that you photograph, and the smell of popcorn. And Lola, your discussion of history, and the way images hold history, but also can be a way of imagining a new future. So we have a question from an attendee about uncertainty, and it reads, can you describe when you believe a photograph must have a clear and certain message rather than allow for differing interpretations and emotional responses? much of the discussion has focused on the power and value of uncertainty.
Mhm. I don't think it's possible as an artist to I don't think it's possible as an artist to almost dictate. I mean, you were putting something out there, and you might put a question out there, but the audience themselves might have thousands and thousands of other questions that come from that the artist never seen. So I think that that's like an open-ended kind of situation. Like I don't think that you can draw them to a place, but you can't you can't make that determination of what that actually is going to be. I don't think, you know. Does that answer the question somewhat?
Does anyone else want to chime in?
Yeah, I would chime in just because for me, that's a big joy of not just photography, but of visual art is to, we all bring our own experiences to looking. And I think one of the hardest things to do is to just look, right? And to learn and know what we know from what we see. So, I think there are many photographers who are extraordinary, whose images have shaped our understanding of moments in history, and they don't leave much uncertainty, right? And I think of so many images that from World Press Awards, and we know what we know because of what we've seen through those photographers' eyes. And at the same time, on the art side, bringing our own experiences. I mean, I think that's where the beauty of it is, and Lola, I'm just so inspired by the way that you keep talking about finding joy, right? Even in painful moments of history, even in painful images, that, that's the beauty of what art affords us, right? That we can look and we can see the terror and we can also see the joy. I mean, Séan, that was a brilliant choice of Siskin's Levitation, right? Of pleasure and terror, right?
Right.
They can do both.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny for me when you look at photographs. If it doesn't have that question in it, it's not enough for me. But that's a personal taste thing. But I remember one day we were at our studio museum when I was working there as a curator, and we had a guest there, a guest artist, Leroy Clark from Trinidad, and he had a visitor. The visitor was Derek Walcott. And Derek decided he would sit and talk about art. He would just talk about it. And he said, one of the problems with art today is that there's not enough self-amazement by the producer of the art. And when you looked at that, you looked and said, I didn't know I had that in me. I didn't know I could say something that way. But he talked about self-amazement as something missing. And I think that's one of the things that makes work interesting. The fact when the artist himself looks at it and says, good God, I didn't intend that, but it's there and I really love it, so.
Right.
Yeah, that's why I love having shows. I like to, kind of be a fly on the wall and listen to what people have to say. And then I think, oh yeah, I meant that too. Or I didn't mean that, but I'm glad it means that to them. Or, you know what I mean? I think it's wonderful.
Right,
I think
right.
it's like reading a book, isn't it? Like everyone gets, or reading a poem. We all get different messages from the arts. And I think that's exciting.
It is. And it's the most amazing thing when someone sees your work and it seems that they know more about the piece than you do. It's like, yeah.
Yep, that's what I meant.
Exactly what you thought. Can I just quote you? Write that down. Okay.
Séan, again, I want to thank you for inviting us together to come together and talk about work.
You're more than welcome. And the three of you are just pioneers in your own right and what you do and the way that you approach photography. And your love for photography is just so profound. I feel it whenever I talk to any one of you. We just gravitate right back to the same conversation. It's just amazing, and yeah, I've been talking with Elizabeth about photography for over 30 years. It's like, it's like amazing. I hate to say that. I guess I should have said maybe 15 years. Let's just cut it in half. But yeah, so it's just an amazing time. And And thank you everyone here for participating. When we asked everyone, when we made up our list, you three were on the top, and I was like, well, I don't know if we can get these three, but we'll start there and we'll see what happened. And you all responded, so I really appreciate it.
I also want to thank all of you and Sean as well on behalf of the Colby Museum. We're so grateful you could join us and be part of this exhibition and its associated programs, and to really also show how these networks of photographers are vibrant and growing things. And one way to do that is through images, but also through conversation. Sean, is there anything else you wanted to close? I want to give one plug for our next program this spring before we all sign off. But if there's anything more that you wanted to say before we do.
Thank you, Beth. Yes, and plug your next show.
This is for our education department. So first I should mention that Active Site, the Tsiaras Family Photography Collection, will be on view through August 14. So we're really heading into spring and summer. So please come and visit us here in Maine, or come this way if you live in Maine. And our next Art End program will feature Dred Scott and Maria Gaspar speaking on art, ethics, and process. This is a virtual program, and it will take place on 5 p.m. on April 26. Thank you again for joining us tonight. We hope we will see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great to see you all.
Thank you. I'll see everyone later.